Hello out there. Thanks for joining us in the third of our Advocating for Impact workshop series. Today we're going to be exploring how to navigate the executive branch and what advocacy looks like during the regulatory process. First, Colorado Health Foundation is the host and sponsor of this series. Our vision is that across Colorado, each of us can say that we have all we need to live healthy lives. The goals for today's webinar are to explore the legal parameters that nonprofits can engage in during the regulatory and rulemaking process. We're also going to explore what the process looks like in the state of Colorado and what state agencies do when they promulgate rules and regulations. We are going to answer how engaging in the regulatory process can advance an organization's mission. And finally, we hope to answer and provide some insight into what effective strategies and tactics for influencing the regulatory and rulemaking process are. A couple quick notes: if you've tuned into our past webinars on advocating for impact, you notice a big section of it was consumed by legal analysis and legal insight. That is not a focus of this webinar for the reason that there are no restrictions for what 501c3s can do in this space. 501c3 tax status does not restrict a nonprofit organization's engagement in regulatory advocacy. Regulatory advocacy is not lobbying. Lobbying is attempting to influence specific legislation, bills introduced in the state legislature and ballot measure process. I want to take the time to introduce today's presenters. From ORS Impact, we have Sarah Stachowiak. From the Secretary of State's Office, Deputy Secretary of State, Suzanne Steyert. And from the Colorado Children's Campaign, we have the Early Childhood Initiative's Vice President, Bill Jager. And with that, I will kick it over to Sarah, who will be presenting on her reports Beyond the Win.
Thank you. Before we jump in, I'm just going to provide a little bit of background about where this piece came from as context. So the Atlantic Philanthropies a few years ago was interested in making some investments as part of their spend down strategy to look back at what they had learned and what they could share with the field about advocacy and policy change. And one of the things they really were interested in looking into was better understanding how advocates could be successful in this idea of a pivot from getting a policy win to moving into implementation. And part of this came from some investments they'd made around healthcare reform in the US, and a sense that maybe that transition had been rockier than it needed to be. And so they asked us to do some exploring to understand what is the role of advocates once you get past a policy win, and how could it be done most effectively. And so to develop this piece, we talked with advocates and funders to better understand what it really looks like on the ground. And we also looked into some of the literature out there to know what could we say could strengthen the likelihood of a policy win really bearing the desired fruit. So people are probably pretty familiar, if you're watching this webinar, with the stages of a policymaking life cycle. And I would say in my experience, people focus a lot on sort of getting an issue on the agenda in some way, coming up with policy solutions, and then hopefully getting that policy win, and then hopefully riding off into the sunset, feeling like you had a success. Unfortunately, it's not always the case that once you finish there that you are guaranteed that that policy will be implemented in the way you had hoped for and intended. I'll tell a short story here about a case when we saw success of this happening. So in California, there was a policy to make more early learning programs available for 4-year-olds. Now, once this policy passed, the advocates and funders realized that it was going to be a staged approach and phased in, and they really needed to be able to show that this was working and it was feasible to be able to sustain that funding and support. So they had some key advocates who were able to be involved in the regulatory process, and they did a lot of other things too. They identified school districts that could be early adopters who could really share some success stories. They developed a community of practice to bring people together so they could learn from each other. And they had a funder who invested in more money for research and evaluation so they could really understand whether they were on track or not. And fortunately, they felt like they were really successful in getting that to move forward. And some of that story illustrates what I want to talk about when we start thinking about policy implementation. There are ways that it is different from policy adoption. So I'm going to share a few of the characteristics we found from talking to advocates and vendors. The first is that technical expertise matters a lot. You need to be able to be in a room with somebody who's really on the weeds in a particular policy and set of regulations and be able to stick to specific recommendations and the rationale behind them. One of the advocates I spoke to said, you know, you need to be able to say on page 4, paragraph 3, line 22, it needs to be 3, and say why that's the case. It's not as simple as an up and down vote might be when you're talking to elected officials. Another important characteristic is that there are different stakeholders and their motivations are different. Most of them don't need to be reelected, so you will have to use some different tools out of your toolkit. You have people working at administrative agencies, you have people who might be part of intermediary organizations, and there's a lot of good literature out there about sort of bureaucracies and what makes people operate differently in bureaucracies. There may be some risk aversion. You have people who really care a lot and who think a lot about sort of turf and resources, and you need to figure out how to navigate in that different kind of circumstance. You also have some different people who start getting interested once a policy has been adopted. Some of that can be end beneficiaries, and you also still need to account for people who may have felt like they lost in the policy adoption process. The regulatory process is still a place and a time where you can come in and really try and, you know, secure a win or make something feel less bad to you, and that is going to continue from people who may not have wanted the policy win in the first place. The other thing that surprised us a little bit when we went into this process was this idea that it's much more relationship-based. Oppositional approaches are less useful. We expected to hear people talk a lot about sort of a watchdog role, and that really didn't come up. It really is a much more of a situation where you get to know people, you know how you can help them be effective in their job, and that those relationships need to be there so that you can have those conversations, getting into the nitty-gritty about what regulations and rules should look like. Venues can change, right? You can get a federal policy win that's going to filter down to the states. At a state level, you can start thinking about sort of local implementation issues. We did some work in California with some education advocates who were really pleased with the big policy win they had around some school reform issues. And yet, when it came down to go to the school level, they had no capacity. They were caught really flat-footed with being able to engage meaningfully at the district level to help that policy be enacted in the ways they wanted it to occur. So really thinking about where and how that's going to happen will be important to make sure you have the right internal capacity or partnerships in place to handle that shift. Finally, as I mentioned, the original question of us was, how do we make a better pivot? We heard loud and clear from advocates, there is no pivot. This needs to be part of the thinking all along the way, and if you're just thinking about it after a policy win, you are way too late and way behind the ball. One short story I can share that illustrates this is there's an advocacy group in Washington State where I'm from who at the 11th hour was able to get in a one-time spending bill to support more low-income schools providing food over the summer through schools. They were really proud. It felt like a great win. I'm sure they wrote it in all their grant reports. But in the end, things did not go as they planned. The administrating agency was really mad that they got something through at the last minute and had not been consulted and were not on board. They were able to make rules that made it very hard for districts to get the money, that included things like they could only use things they bought during the summer. So if they needed to buy a major piece of equipment, they were going to be able to use it half the time. And so this really illustrated to us that while that win can feel really good, if you have not built those relationships, thought about who these other stakeholders are, and kind of consulted them along the way, you may not actually see what you hope to see.
Sarah, can you talk a little bit about how organizations can set themselves up for success so they're not caught flat-footed after that win?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is about how you're engaging some of these stakeholders early on. I noted earlier that some of these motivations are different, and some of the literature around bureaucracies really talk about agency leaders, have a lot of masters, and they have to really work in sort of a constrained environment because they're told a lot of things that they can and can't do. So if you don't have them on board and having them help you think about what's going to be a practical, implementable policy early on, you can really get in trouble down the road, for one example. Another thing we hear is also thinking about who those end beneficiaries are and how are you bringing them up to speed and helping them know what they can expect and how they might get engaged later in the process.
That's great. Thank you.
Yeah. sort of framing pieces that might be helpful for thinking about this kind of advocacy in a regulatory environment. We realized as we were talking to people that we were hearing a lot of different stories about what this looked like, and they were not all the same. And realized that people were really talking about 3 different kinds of activities that are helpful during this stage of policymaking. The first was the one we went in thinking we wanted to know about, which was administrative advocacy. So really being able to come in and be part of the rulemaking process. But that was not all we heard. We also heard a lot of stories that really fit into this bucket of implementation advocacy. So what could advocates do to really help ensure that implementation was going well? Making sure people were aware of opportunities that were out there, that money was being spent that was intended to support the implementation of policies they cared about, and making sure that really that work was happening on the ground as intended. And then last of all, we heard a lot about this, it goes to the question you just asked us, and ongoing capacity maintenance, that you need to be able to sustain those relationships, know the people and the players. It also goes back to that point of it's not really a pivot, that you need to be keeping an eye on who the key players are and how you think about engaging stakeholders all along the way. A couple of other frameworks I want to share that I think are helpful for sort of conceptualizing this work and thinking about it and talking about it is how you think about policy implementation and how it happens. There are a couple standard ways of thinking about this in political science, and one is top-down theory. And so this is just really the belief that for policies to be successful, you want to define them as clearly and completely as possible from the top, and then that sort of filters down to be implemented. It can also be called programmed implementation or command and control. These are things where you know what needs to happen and things need to be set up so they happen as you expect them to, and you don't want a lot of variability. On the next slide, you'll see there are some assumptions or characteristics of top-down policies that make them more successful. So this is appropriate when there are clear objectives and you know what you expect to happen out of a result. So this might be thinking about supporting evidence-based programs. You know that there is research behind them, that they should have the outcomes you want. There are processes to ensure compliance because you know you want this done with fidelity to have the outcomes that you expect. It assumes that you have people on the ground who are committed and skilled, and you have enough support that that's not getting in the way of implementation, and that really you think all of these can happen without having to take into account changes in sort of the economic conditions around you. This can be really helpful for things like taxes. I've been thinking about other places. I've seen this in Washington State. There's new minimum wage laws that sort of come in different ways for different groups, or family leave acts, things that you don't want employers to decide how they want to do it. You really want there to be consistency across the board. Now, the arguments against this, of course, is that it is not accounting for what implementers on the ground know and could maybe do to make implementation more successful, and that some things are very complex and you cannot just top-down figure out how to make them happen exactly as expected. The flip side of this coin, of course, is bottom-up theory. So rather than thinking you need to find everything from the top and have it flow down, this is thinking that success will be heavily tied to the context that the work happens within, and that there really needs to be much more room for adaptation and adaptability. I was thinking about an example of early childhood education and supports in Washington, where their policies have created regional councils who could understand what kind of local capacities exist, what resources exist, what would be the best fit for the families in that particular area, rather than saying, boom, everybody implement this particular program. These are especially good when you have a lot of interaction between the policy and the local context. So as I just mentioned, the early childhood example, what kind of resources and access are available, what kind of social capital is on the ground, that you can adapt at the local level and things can be more flexible, and that there are ways to engage more directly with those who are going to be impacted by the policy. The critiques here really have to do with you're giving a lot of power to people who weren't elected. There's not a lot of accountability when you're sort of devolving responsibility to a different level, and you run the risk of greater variability of the process and results when you have more open-endedness around this kind of thing.
It sounds like in the bottom-up approach that there could be a tension across regions as well, as it sounds like there's each area region has some autonomy in how they can implement it. Is that?
Yeah, that's true. Yes, and I think, you know, another risk you run there is if one region's really gung-ho and putting a lot of time and resources into it, and the other one's just sort of doing the bare minimum, you're really going to see quite different kinds of implementation.
I think we see that in Colorado quite a bit with, a lot of our programs are state funded but administered at the county level.
Right. Yeah, Colorado does a lot of bottom-up, I believe, in many states, right, with more local controls. I wanted to share this framework because I think even in describing those, I'm sure you're sitting here thinking it can't always be top-down and it can't always be bottom-up, and that's really true. And so there are a number of ways that people have tried to wrestle with this. How do you understand these different models and when to apply them? And one that made the most sense to us that we thought was helpful to bring forward was this idea that you should think about top-down, bottom-up, or even a hybrid of them, depending on the amount of conflict there is around the policy at hand and how much ambiguity there is about how to solve the problem. So when you have things that are in the bottom left quadrant, so low conflict and low ambiguity, these can be top-down. People know what they need. Nobody's going to be too upset about it. You want that consistency. While this might not always be the case, a traditional example here is immunization. On the quadrant above, where you have high conflict and low ambiguity, this is where you might think about something like taxes. Not everybody wants to pay taxes, but it's clear what the tax rate should be and how to apply those. And so that is another place where top-down might be the most appropriate. On the bottom right, where you don't have a lot of conflict but a lot of ambiguity, is where the bottom-up is really the best fit. So again, this might be something like universal pre-K, or we've done some other work where regions have flexibility around prevention programming, that sort of thing. So what's going to be the best fit given the resources and the populations in a particular place? The upper right, where you have high conflict and high ambiguity, is a place where you need a little bit of both. A good example here is climate change. Not everybody agrees. Not everybody agrees on the problem or the solution. And so figuring out how you address that conflict and ambiguity in a place like that can be important to think about. Where is top-down the right fit and where is bottom-up is probably not either. For any of these, in our brief, you could find that we have some descriptions about how you think about the differences in advocacy strategies and tactics for advocates when you think about where a policy issue you might be working on sits relative to this matrix. So before you move on to talk to people with more concrete examples, I'm just going to share 5 considerations that might be helpful for your thinking. One is thinking about a theory of change. So it's been common practice for advocacy and policy evaluation, at least for many years, to think about what kind of outcomes you expect and when. But too often they've probably gone down to a policy win and then impact at the end of the bottom of the map. Better case is that you acknowledge that implementation needs to happen, but in reality what we've learned through this work is there also need to be strategies that you're thinking about and implementing all along the way. So how are those showing up, whether it's administrative work, implementation work, or capacity maintenance? Another consideration is thinking about how those tactics will differ. As noted earlier, there's different kind of expertise required, different relationships, not always, wanting strong conflict. You might also think about not only your own tactics, but who are you partnering with? One thing we heard is sometimes you'll have advocacy organizations who really are mostly about sort of pushing those policies through. But if that's true, how are you thinking about a handoff or partnerships or others who can make sure that implementation still occurs? Here, have you thought about who the main implementation actors are going to be and how their motivations may be different than others? Is it going to be agency staff? Are there going to be intermediaries? How involved will and beneficiaries likely be? And when and how are you going to engage them through your work? Another consideration is how have you thought about including beneficiaries and stakeholders in this work to inform rulemaking? Depending on the topic, you may really want to think about how people on the ground can provide feedback into that and how policies can best serve the needs of the people who are going to be on the receiving end. And finally, because we're an evaluator and we love reflection and learning, how can you think about what your hypotheses are? How can you make sure you take the time to to learn and reflect on what's worked and hasn't worked so that you can continue refining your work and think about effective implementation going forward. The last thing I'll share is in the Beyond the When piece. There's more than what I've just shared here. There's some breakdown around bureaucracy, different types of bureaucracies and what that might mean for how you think about interacting with them. Some background literature about sort of democracy and how democracy plays out in different ways. And for all these sections, we include implications for advocacy strategies and tactics, and also evaluation and learning considerations.
Great, thank you, Sarah. And as a reminder for all of our listeners, you'll be able to access that Beyond the Win report and all other materials on the website. So if you found the webinar, you are close to the resources. Next, I'd like to turn it over to Suzanne, Deputy Secretary of State in Colorado. And in the state of Colorado, the Secretary of State's office is responsible for working with every state agency as they promulgate rules that they're responsible for. So they have a unique vantage point on this process and can provide great insight into what this looks like in Colorado.
Thanks. So at the Secretary of State's office, we have a bit of a dual role because we also do our own rulemaking. I think in the quadrant that we would say was high conflict and high ambiguity because we work in elections. So, so I just wanted to tag on to a little bit of what Sarah was talking about because I think it's really important for stakeholders to be thinking about that regulatory process, you know, at the beginning before legislation is introduced because you know, the problem with taking legislation through without involving the regulatory group that's going to enact it is that they may have good suggestions for you in the writing of the regulation, and they're also the people you're going to have to work with on the back end. So, you know, we have experienced cases where we find out at the last minute when a bill is about to be introduced that it impacts our office, and it's generally kind of a fire drill to figure out, you know, what are the impacts, are we going to have a rulemaking authority, what's that going to look like, you know, and how is the department going to deal with it. You don't have that kind of fire drill in the middle of a session with the legislature if you have brought them in on the front end. And sometimes what we have seen, and I think that this has gotten better throughout the years, but we've seen groups that believe that we will be not friendly to their activity, so we will politically oppose what they're doing. And this actually comes up a lot with ballot initiatives too, so not just necessarily things going through the legislature, but when people are writing their own legislation. And in Colorado, we're probably one of the easiest states in the country to access the ballot because it's a citizen process that requires two people, about 100,000 signatures, and your questions on the ballot. We have one of the longest ballots in the country because of the ease of which citizens can put things on. And you see a whole lot of issues that are controversial that can't get through the legislature that end up on the ballot. Those have to do with healthcare, with education, with elections, things like that, that citizens have tried to run through the legislature and can't.
And that's, sorry, just put a plug in real fast. If you scroll back through the Advocating for Impact site, we do have an entire workshop on advocating the ballot measures as well. So
right.
Great plug.
So even with the ballot measures, we have people who come to us ahead of writing the language, and they'll say, you know, we know you're going to be opposed to this, you know, politically, but would you mind looking at what we're doing so that we can see that at least you can implement it in a way that works for everybody. So I think agencies are really good about putting aside their own personal feelings about whether something is a good policy or a bad policy and looking at how is this going to be implemented. Let's assume it's going to pass, and let's assume we're going to have to implement it. What does that look like? Because I think most agencies want to do the best job they can, even if they didn't agree with the policy when it was going through. So I think it's really important to have that good relationship, not just because it makes the rulemaking easier, but also because it makes the legislation better. So I thought that was a really good point, and certainly one that we have worked with our stakeholders on. So the dual role we have is we also, in addition to doing our own rulemaking authority, we run the Colorado Registry, which is the where promulgation of rules goes through. People file all their rules with our office. So I'm going to go through some of the nuts and bolts of that. But in Colorado, rulemaking authority is set in the statute. And so in each piece of legislation, there may be rulemaking authority given to an agency. It may even be required that they do some rulemaking. So you may see it as that the agency may promulgate or the agency must promulgate. And sometimes it's silent. And if it's silent, then the agency has no authority to promulgate. The rulemaking process is governed by the State Administrative Procedure Act, which is in Title 24 of our statutes. And it provides the entire process for the rulemaking in addition to the hearings and the comment period. The rulemaking process is legislative in nature, so agencies can communicate directly with stakeholders during the process. So that's a little bit different than agencies. A lot of time the person in ours is the same. The person who conducts the hearings will conduct rulemaking hearings. They may also conduct other kinds of hearings that are not legislative in nature. So we conduct hearings on elections issues that are, or we chair the title board. Those are more adjudicatory, and you cannot, have that kind of contact with people outside of the process. We call that quasi-judicial when you're ruling on one certain thing. But in the rulemaking process, it's legislative, it's prospective in nature, and so you can engage with your stakeholders during that process. And the statutes actually say that the agencies are supposed to identify a set of stakeholders and communicate with them prior to promulgating rules. And so we do that at our office through pre-notice. And so anytime we're going to do rules, we'll send out a pre-notice, kind of a draft of a draft, basically, that tells people what our ideas are, and the people who are on our list, and we walk through how to sign up on that, can sign up, and then they can engage in that process on the front end before we even publish draft rules. So that's something to keep in mind as you go through the process. So the Colorado Register, that's published twice monthly, and it's the official publication for state agency rulemakings, and it has the notice of all the rulemakings, proposed new and amended rules, and also the Attorney General opinions. And we publish the annual department regulatory agendas and other public notices and calendars. So that you will find on our website. This is a slide of the website. If you go to the website under front page, you'll see Colorado Register, and click on that. That's our official publication. And then you go to next page, and this is where you can sign up for those rulemakings that you're interested in. And so you see here the register publication, and then at the bottom it's sign up to receive email updates. So
Susan, are you able to sign up for only notifications on subject matters that you're interested in, or do you have to sign up for the entire list?
No, you can sign up for matters you're interested in by agency or by topic. And so I think that might be on the next page here. So here you put in your email address, and then this drop-down menu is agencies of interest. And so you go down and you select under that all the agencies that you have an interest in monitoring whatever their rulemaking activities are. And so you subscribe to that, and then you become part of the group that they communicate with. And so we do ours through an e-delivery notice to all of our subscribers for rulemaking. So, and then on the next page, the e-docket page, that's where the agency rule filings are found. And so on the website, if you want to go in and search rules and look things up, that's where you can do that on our pages. Each agency also has their own. If you go to their individual websites, you'll find their own rulemakings on there, but we publish it as a group. And so then you would put in the date filed, the tracking numbers, the agency. This one, since it's the entire state, you'll have to track it by the agency and actually have the number, or do it by the field of the date filed. So that's how you search in our e-docket pages. And then it would bring up the details of the tracking number, and then you can go in, and if you click through further, you would see the actual rule that was promulgated. So that's kind of a real nuts and bolts of how our website works in terms of those notifications. The rulemaking timelines in Colorado, it's actually a pretty long process, so there's a lot of room for engagement. The agency files the notice, and you see there's a publishing deadline, the 15th or the end of the month. It's then published in the Colorado Registry, and the agency has to wait at least 20 days to hold the rulemaking hearing. Many agencies wait longer than that. And then at the rulemaking hearing, we'll get into that a little bit in the next slide. But after the rulemaking hearing, they can adopt the rule anytime within 180 days after the hearing. So there's a long process where there can be comment after, depending on how the agency goes through the rulemaking. And then once the rule is adopted, the agency requests opinion from the Attorney General's office. So in permanent rulemaking, after the agency adopts the rule, the AG issues the opinion, and then the agency files adopted rules with our office and with the Office of Legislative Legal. So Colorado has a number of steps you go through even after the adoption of the rule, which includes that opinion from the Attorney General, and then the Office of Legislative Legal actually during the summer reviews every single rule that's on the books in Colorado. And they will recommend, if they think an agency has exceeded its rulemaking authority, they'll recommend that the rule expire. So curiously, in Colorado, all rules, this is kind of an interesting side note, but all rules technically expire in May 15th of every year. And the legislature has to adopt a bill to extend the rule. And if they don't adopt that bill, the rules all expire of every single administrative agency. But the way that that bill is put up, it's generally, it will identify all the ones that Office of Legislative Legal believes exceeded the rulemaking authority. And then it will recommend that the rest go forward. And then the bill is brought before the General Assembly, and then every year it's passed. But it could happen one year that all rules just expire. The General Assembly can also pull rules out of order. So if an agency promulgates a rule that they believe is problematic, they can actually pull that rule and review it themselves, and they do that through committee at the legislature. That's a combined committee of the House and the Senate, and they'll review agency rules based on that schedule too during the session. So we've had that happen also, where some of our rules have been pulled out of order. The registry, the rules are published in the registry, and then they become effective 20 days after publication, and then they're published in the Colorado Code of Regulations. Now, there's another way agencies promulgate rules, and we probably do this more than most, but agencies can also promulgate emergency rules or temporary rules. And those can be adopted if the agency finds the immediate adoption is imperative to comply with federal law or regulation or preservation of health, safety, welfare. This happens a lot if a bill is effective upon signature. Then you can imagine that if there's rulemaking authority in there, then it's very difficult to do much of anything within the time frames that I just talked about, because that's, a couple of months period. And so if a bill is signed effective upon signature, emergency rules may be promulgated at that time. A lot of times these come up for our agency when we didn't anticipate something. So in an election some sort of election dispute, something happens and we didn't anticipate certain things happening, we may adopt temporary emergency rules. We did this quite publicly with our presidential electors in the last election. We didn't anticipate they would try to vote for somebody that didn't get the popular vote in Colorado, and so we had to adopt emergency rules that addressed what would happen if they still went forward and tried to vote for somebody who didn't receive the popular vote. What would the replacement look like? So they were technical in nature, but they were something that was not anticipated, and so that was done through an emergency rule. Those are then automatically expired after 90 days, and so the agency will adopt the rule, then request the AG opinion. The rule is effective upon adoption, and then published in the registry, and then they automatically expire if the agency doesn't go forward and promulgate a formal rulemaking. Sometimes we do, and sometimes we don't. It's really up to the agency. We did on the elector case. Sometimes we adopt an emergency rule, and then when we then in the next session, we'll go ahead and let it expire, and then in the next legislative session, we'll ask the legislature to fix whatever it was that we didn't anticipate. And so, those are used for different types of situations.
Is it ever the case where emergency rules are put into place and then ultimately become permanent rules through a separate process, or is it, in your what you've experienced, is it really just a kind of short-term fix?
Usually they are something that an agency is going to promulgate permanently. It might end up looking a little different though, because a lot of times when you adopt an emergency rule, you might not have gotten it right the first time because you didn't have the public comment time period available, and so you tried something and it was something you needed to do, but it needed to be tweaked. And so most emergency rules when we do emergency rules, often we do the rule, and at the same time we publish it as our pre-notice. So here's our emergency rule, and by the way, we're starting our promulgation of a formal rule. That way we get comment right away, and then we will make it a formal rule later. But most people, I think, adopt these with the purpose in mind of having something permanent. Sometimes we won't if we did an emergency rule that we really would prefer to see in legislation. Then we'll just do it for the term of the election, we'll let it expire, and then we'll go back to the legislature and see if this is something that we can get agreement on now that we've identified the problem. So that's something to keep in mind about emergency rules. They're done very quickly. Often agencies will try to get as much input as they can, but there's no comment period required. So in Colorado, all of the promulgation of rules is done publicly. All public comments are published on the website. The meetings themselves and the hearings are taped and often streamed. We stream all of our meetings. Written comments can be submitted after the notice and up until the hearing date, and then often at the hearing you'll find out how long the record is kept open afterwards. So typically we'll keep our record open for another 7 days after a hearing, and they are all part of the official record. So you can do written comments, you can also do in-person comments, and depending upon the hearing and the agency, they'll have the oral testimony and they'll allow opportunities for questions and discussions. So you kind of have to decide where you want to land, and some people do both. I find the in-person to be really helpful, but we're an agency that has a lot of Q&A when they're up there doing the rulemaking. I know some agencies it might be just reading your written comments as the record, and it doesn't really provide you anything else, but we do a lot of question and answer at public comment, and so I like when people come in because I can, I can kind of tease out whatever their issue is. And then in written comments, I think, certainly that allows you to take your time and put down what you want. I find it the most helpful if somebody is commenting on a rule that they don't like, if they provide me with what they think alternative language should be. Merely just commenting that you don't like something is not all that helpful to me. We're generally trying to promulgate something that works for everybody, and so to the extent that you have, good language that you think works for your stakeholders, I find that to be really helpful and not insulting at all. So
for the public comment period, does each rulemaking authority have their own process, or is there some consistent themes across all of the agencies and boards?
Well, everybody has a comment period open where you can provide written comment. Once you get to the hearing itself, it's probably going to be different depending on the agency, and depending on maybe the adversarial nature of, it's kind of hard to tell. Some agencies may be less likely to do a Q&A. If they think it's going to result in litigation of some sort, they may be pretty quiet up there. And some agencies will limit the amount of time someone can talk, much like you see at the legislature. We will only if we have a packed room. So, even within our agency, it's going to depend on what kind of room you walk into. If there's 100 people, you're going to limit everyone to 3 minutes, just for the courtesy of the other 99 there. There's no other reason. If you walk in and there's 4 people, you're likely to have a long dialogue with each person who showed up. But all agencies are required to take public comment. It's just a matter of, much like the legislature, what it looks like at the time. But I don't know if your experience is different in terms of advocating in Colorado, but that's pretty much what we have on our side from the Secretary of State's office, and
yeah, that was very helpful, thank you. Last and certainly not least, we have Bill Jager with the Colorado Children's Campaign. Colorado Children's Campaign is an advocacy organization that really excels in this space. So we're looking forward to hearing from Bill about what this looks like for his organization, and hopefully we'll be able to take some of those tactics to our own organizations.
Great, thanks. So those of you who aren't familiar, the Children's Campaign, we're a research, policy, and advocacy organization. We're most commonly known for our Kids Count in Colorado report that looks at the state of child well-being across a whole host of indicators. And we work primarily in the areas of early childhood health and K-12 education. And so I've had the opportunity to testify in front of the State Board of Human Services, the State Board of Education, and also the board that oversees the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment. So regulatory advocacy, to the larger point, is sort of built into our DNA of how we think about achieving policy change. And so I think my task today is to maybe highlight some ways that we think about what has been successful and maybe highlight some lessons learned when we haven't gotten it quite right. And those are things that we're constantly trying to improve upon. So if we look first, I think I tried to be pithy and identify sort of 3 R's of regulatory advocacy, but I think the larger report around Beyond the Wind gives you another sort of framework, but I was pleased to see the alignment across kind of what you all highlighted compared to kind of what our experience has been. So we would largely say research, relationships, and rallying folks. I really struggled for that last R, but I got there. Are kind of how we try to think about our work in the regulatory arena as an extension of our state policy advocacy work. So the first, research, I think it lines well with the Beyond the Wind report, sort of conceptualization of technical expertise. Certainly, there are some instances where a rule is a rule is a rule, and you don't have to have a ton of expertise, but to, I think, know when, for example, as the Secretary of State's office highlights, a rule is coming up for review, there's a public comment period, how one accesses that, who the other affected partners would be, the way the state agency might think about that rule, and where actually in the Colorado Code this regulatory opportunity might appear is a degree of technical expertise that is something we kind of try to cultivate, recognizing that we can bring that, but the success in getting that rule change takes a much bigger table. So I think it kind of speaks to the importance of understanding what other states are doing, either through statute or rule, what rules govern the sort of programs that you care most deeply about, what's working in those. And all of that research we tend to think of perhaps at times as data and technical and policy language, and that's true. But more than anything else, for us, that research is probably informed most directly by those who are either implementing the program or are recipients of the benefit that the program is achieving or seeking to achieve, or is the provider of the service. So in the space that I work, that oftentimes means we're talking a lot with child care providers, or we're talking a lot with parents and families who receive a child care subsidy, or perhaps it is educators in the classroom who are thinking about how to implement an early literacy initiative. And so that research piece is certainly a policy research, but it's also the conversations that we all really try to have with affected communities when it comes to public policy. And as a policy organization, that's something that we're always striving to build bridges around. And that's why I think some of the best advocacy comes when you have partners around the table who may have policy expertise, but in other instances are the ones who are actually living the daily life of a program. And so I think there's a strong role for everything from statewide organizations to community-based groups to regular folks who are trying to navigate the systems we set up. So that's kind of the research piece. I think the second, and this is one that I think it can't be understated, is the importance of relationships. I think, the Secretary of State's office highlights that when they say, it would have been great oftentimes if you checked in with us early on in the process, either at the statutory stage or the regulatory stage, to really understand where those agency leaders going to fall on whatever policy change that might be. And so it is something that more often than not, our experience in government is people are really trying to all row in the same direction to make a positive difference on our economy or our kids or our communities. And so really understanding what's motivating those agency leaders, and for us, more often than not, is we're all kind of seeing the world the same way. It's just we have different avenues to get there. So it's something that we find with most of the agencies we work with is really welcome. Taking the time to pick up the phone and say, hey, I noticed that you have a notice of public comment coming out around school-age childcare. Can you tell me what that's looking like? Can you tell me what you're nervous about? What do you think the opportunities are? What have you heard? What's prompting this? I think just having those direct conversations with those agency leaders, in our experience, oftentimes you go, oh gosh, I don't want to bug very busy people. Overwhelmingly, they're appreciative to know that people are tracking closely. And I think that extends to our state board members. For the state agencies we work with, we have some state board members, like the Department of Education, who are elected by congressional district. It's partisan elections. And so that's one sort of relationship. These are elected officials who are perhaps playing in that world. But more often than not, with groups like the Department of Human Services, these are gubernatorial appointed volunteers who are giving their time because they bring some level of expertise to this work. And so they are not oftentimes engaged in the same way around the public policy debate. The rules they see are brought forward by the state agency, and they perhaps lack the technical expertise to pick apart 80 programs within a single department, and now we've got rules on TANF today and childcare tomorrow and SNAP the next day, and geez, do I know all of these programs? So that's a place where interest groups, like ours for one, but many others, having those relationships and being a trusted source of perspective we find is appreciated. Because oftentimes it's the agency that is looking for that external feedback, or it's the only voice they hear from are the entity that's about to be regulated. And that is one important and really valuable perspective on implementation, but perhaps lacks some of the perspective around why it might be good for somebody, for us who try to be a voice for kids, that while it might create an additional change in practice by a provider, could actually be a really beneficial thing for a child. And so that's where we think those relationships are really important. Again, with internal to the agency, and then also knowing who the state board members are. I think that also helps underscore what motivations might exist for those policymakers who are going to adopt the rules or bring the rules forward. So that's the relationship piece for us. And then the last piece is rallying. We oftentimes say and truly believe advocacy is a team sport. It's extremely rare that any sort of meaningful policy change happens because one person caught something that nobody else thought of and happened to raise their hand and say, geez, did you know that might not work? Or this would be really good. We find that rallying folks during the public comment period, either through joint sign-on letters, shared messaging, shared agreements about what would be important, alongside with testimony, is a really effective strategy. I will say, though, and I'll talk about this in maybe the two examples that I'm going to highlight of where we've tried to do some of this work, it is different than state policymakers within the Golden Dome and legislation, where I think in the Beyond the Wind report, the notion that the quote I wrote down, oppositional approaches are often less useful, it has very much been our experience. We've tried different tactics, and sometimes when you take a tactic that with a committee at the legislature in terms of a petition or a phone call or an action alert, that's felt very differently at the regulatory level because the engagement feels very different in the level of technical expertise. So I would say that certainly rallying and building that team of supporters is key, but the tactics that we've found feel just slightly different than the state policy side. So I will talk about just 2 examples of regulatory policy change that we've been engaged in just in the past couple of years to highlight ways that we see the regulatory process as a really great extension of the public policy advocacy piece, as well as maybe to highlight some differences in the ways these opportunities come up. So to talk first, we have a program in Colorado called the Colorado Child Care Assistance Program, sometimes referred to CCAP. Essentially, it helps low to moderate income working families afford childcare. And it is a significant program in the state. It's probably a $90 million investment in childcare affordability for Colorado families. And it's been one that has been primarily historically focused on where do we put the kids so the adult can work. A really valuable goal. And yet, as we've learned more about the importance of child development and the value of 2-generation strategies, programs that support both adults and children, the legislature stepped in 2014 and made some pretty substantial changes to that program to turn it much more focused into a 2-generation program. What's the quality of the kids' experience? Do they have continuity of care? Are they seeing disruptions? And that was a bill that got significant bipartisan support. It had no opposition by the time we were done, certainly not where it started. But it included about 20 different policy changes to a $90 million program. So you might imagine it has a pretty contentious process around it. Out of that, though, and through a number of those conversations, it became clear that statute was going to be a very difficult place to get to the level of specificity one would need to see the program implemented in the 64 counties that we have in Colorado with a local control environment, sort of devolved decision-making. So there were a number of instances in the negotiation at the statutory side where we, as a group that were working on this bill, felt that, you know what, we have to leave that to the state board to hash out some of those details. Because you can only go into a certain level of specificity in statute around who's eligible, we were doing a thing, for example, around eliminating the cliff that families experience when they see their income increase a little bit, but then see an immediate drop in benefits. So we were trying to stair-step that a little bit, and that would be a very complicated thing to do in statute. So legislative intent was there, and then left it to the rulemaking process to hash out some of the details. And so in many ways, this regulatory advocacy opportunity came from a direct extension of policy advocacy at the legislature. And knowing that we were going to only get so far with a bill, and we needed to rely on the regulatory process to complete that. And so we got commitments from stakeholders during the legislative advocacy phase to say, let's commit to all sitting around the table together over the next couple of years to, in stages, implement these policy changes with regulatory components. So that felt very different. I think some advocates were worried that some voices are heard louder at the state agency side than in the legislature. Again, the entities that are being regulated or the entities that implement have very close relationships with those state level agencies and those human services state board members. So there were certain things that were really important to get in the statute, but places where we said, you know what, that's a level of detail, that's a level of policy debate that is beyond the scope of legislators, let's look at the regulatory process. And so that was one where we were able to take the unresolved policy tensions and put them into a regulatory scheme. And I don't think a group like the Children's Campaign would have been invited to be part of that table if we didn't have the relationships, as I talked about, with both state agency leaders and State Board of Human Services members, because we were so intimately involved in the legislative advocacy, they wanted us at the table when they were building their stakeholder around crafting rules to implement. So that was one. And then a slightly different set of examples have to do with the rules that regulate child care centers, and school-age childcare is one that we're sort of engaged in right now. This is a place where there wasn't a bill that prompted some review of the rules. It was one where we have a regular review of the rules that govern our childcare programs throughout the state on some periodic schedule. It's usually about every 5 years. And you'll see that throughout statute in different instances where there's a legislative mandate to prompt the state agency to look back and say, are the rules we have actually creating an opportunity, or are they achieving the goals of statute? And it's a place where, back to that sort of technical expertise point, or sort of, what I would say the first R of research, sort of tells us, you know, we better be ready to engage when public comment comes out or the state agency is going to be convening stakeholders around this. And we try to track those and know when there's an opportunity to engage. So to just talk briefly about the Child Care Center rules, this is one where there's been a long conversation about the rules, stakeholders have been involved, and then a set of rules that we'd all worked on, depending on how you count it, anywhere between 2 and a decade, came out for public comment, and they completely left out a number of things that were really important to us and a number of other partners in the health community around healthy eating and active living. And that was a real surprise and disappointment. And so this is an instance where we really tried to use the rallying tactic and the relationship tactic to say to those state agency leaders, you know, we really think we sat around a table and thought we'd agreed that certain changes were really important and they didn't appear in the rules package. And the response from the agency leaders was, we hear you, we're very cognizant about placing additional burdens on our child care providers right now, but if it's really important to the health community, show up in public testimony and public comment in a robust way. And so we did. And so alongside about 20 other partners who care deeply about these issues, we organized a common sign-on letter, common comments, had a strong presence at the state board meeting when the rule went for public hearing, and achieved about 11 substantial policy changes, everything from eliminating sugary drinks from child care facilities to promoting daily, regular physical activity, to eliminating screen time for children under 2. Again, all research-based, evidence-based strategies to improve child health in child care settings, that if we were trying to run a bill on each one of those, that would have its own set of challenges. And given the statutory charge to create healthy early learning opportunities in child care, the regulatory vehicle was one that we thought would be successful.
Bill, I think that that example really indicates the importance of collaboration and coordination across stakeholders. I was wondering if you might be able to expand a little bit on how you engage all of the other interested parties in a particular subject. And we know organizations are all working in their own direction. How do you focus that energy across the coalition?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think part of the work that all of us try to do who have sort of shared interests, whether it be child health or other priorities, is to know what everyone else is really working on and caring a lot about. And so knowing that, for example, we had a strong contingent of partners who are really working on the sugary drinks piece. So Healthier Colorado and Delta Dental and the Health Foundation, Children's Hospital had been involved in some oral health coordinated advocacy. So we knew that was really important. It was something we made sure was included in the rules that we thought would get released for public comment. We had other examples. There's a great deal of good coalition work around immunizations, and we have a wonderful immunization coalition here in Colorado, where we knew which partners cared deeply about those issues. But there are others that we had worked less closely with, for example, the American Heart Association and the Lung Association, who have an advocacy presence at the Capitol, and when recognizing that, geez, we were going to really struggle to get some of the daily physical activity expectations embedded into rules, we thought, who's really going to care about this? And that's where reaching out to those partners. But I think that speaks to the importance of, one, we all need to know what each other are working on, what people are caring about, so that when an organization like ours that's carefully monitoring the Child Care Center rules sees an opportunity, we know that we've got other partners around the table who, if they raise their voice in support of this, we're better off. I will say this was an instance where, so again, the Beyond the Win report, oppositional tactics maybe aren't the way to always to go. It's not that our tactics were oppositional, it was that we had some colleagues had employed tactics we often use at the legislature, an action alert where you send emails to the state board members. And recognizing that those state board members were these volunteers, primarily, who had expertise, they did not get action alerts about anything, ever. And so they were really caught off guard by that, and made them sort of pause and wonder, is there something else going on here that we don't know about? And that led them to take a pause and actually extend the public comment period, which was why applies, but delayed implementation, and was an example of where perhaps in our enthusiasm we overshot a little bit what it would take to get these passed. Because they passed with only one opposition vote, and it just came down to one very specific technical piece, but ultimately were adopted and meaningful change for children in childcare. We're in a similar place right now with school-age childcare rules that are expected to be released for public comment sometime, should have been today, but I haven't checked today, where we want to bring that alignment around those health priorities, and that's one where we're getting the same advocates back together, again, everyone from community-based groups to philanthropic partners to providers themselves advocating for these changes. So I will stop there and just say research, relationships, and then rallying folks. It has parallels to state policy advocacy at the Capitol, but the environment is very different, and the sort of tactics one employs look a little bit different. And I would say, though, what's not different is how meaningful the policy changes in the end. Each of those priorities that we advocated for in those instances could have been standalone bills that we go and try to get in statute, and instead, utilizing the regulatory process gave a real window to package things together and have just as meaningful policy change for children and families.
Thanks so much for that. One follow-up question, but before we wrap up, that I think would be useful for other nonprofit organizations who are looking at maybe exploring this as an advocacy tactic. Children's Campaign has obviously seen great success in this area. The question is, was it difficult to convince your colleagues and your board that this was a useful advocacy avenue, and then dedicate the resources required to do it well?
I would say that my colleagues who work in sort of the policy space understand how important regulatory work is. What is more difficult, perhaps, is certainly not as flashy. It's harder for the development folks to tell the story of, yes, they sat there through a 4-hour public comment period at the State Board of Human Services, and yeah, they got 3 things in. And yet, I think also, as we all know, that's policy change that matters. I would also say it is something where when we're trying to identify the resources to do our work as an organization, it's a place where on the philanthropic side, general operating support is very valuable, because it's hard sometimes to know that, wow, we're now going to have to devote 2 years of Bill's time, probably 10 hours a month, to child care assistance regulations because we passed this bill. And you're not going to see another bill passed on child care assistance, and it might be 18 months before the first rule is adopted. I think that can be difficult. It's less difficult, I think, for our board and our policy folks. It's a little bit more of a challenge to tell that story to donors and to foundations who support our work, that this needs to be sort of embedded in our thinking each year. And we don't pack up after the 120-day legislative session. We're thinking about these opportunities year-round. Thank you.
So thank you so much to all our presenters. We really appreciate you taking the time to share your insight. I know that I learned a lot in the past hour. And thank you all who joined us on the webinar. As a reminder, you can find all of the resources that we mentioned today, as well as some additional materials on our Advocating for Impact webpage. You can also register for upcoming events at the same location. And would encourage everyone to sign up for the Colorado Health Foundation newsletter. That's the best way to become aware of the workshop series as it goes forward, as well as other resources that the Colorado Health Foundation continually puts out. So thank you all again for joining, and we'll look forward to next month.